All right, so everyone's talking about how challenging the upcoming couple of years are going to be from a budget perspective. And that means you need to take control of how dollars flow out of your organization. So, how do you do that? Well, it starts with the data, and specifically data on how, where, when, and with what frequency purchases are being made all across your various departments. You may or may not have a procure to pay platform that makes it easy to measure this type of activity. But to get you inspired, you should go check out Procurify's brand new Charter School Benchmark Report. It just came out a couple weeks ago and offers 10 procurement benchmarks from charter schools across the country, highlighting things like average PO volumes, spend per vendor, items per vendor, how long it takes to go from requisition to PO, and so on. Not only will you be intrigued to answer these same questions for your school, it might also shine a light on opportunities for cost control next year. You can go to procurify.com/resources to download a copy or check out the episode description, and we've linked to it there as well. All right, now back to the show.
Welcome to Charter School Insider, lessons from the nation's top charter school operators, the only podcast dedicated to the behind-the-scenes business of running a successful charter school. Join us as we sit down with charter school leaders who share how they are overcoming the biggest operational hurdles facing their schools today.
Chad, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here. I'm super excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, Danielle, thanks for having me. I'm excited as well and excited to see where we go.
Love it. Well, I know you, but for our audience, do you mind just giving a quick intro on yourself and your role at the Pinnacle?
Absolutely. My name is Chad Miller. I am the CEO of Pinnacle Charter School in Colorado. We are one of the largest and oldest charter schools in the state of Colorado. I've been here at Pinnacle for about 7 years, been in the charter space in Colorado for a little over 10 years as school leader. And then my background is really actually in business. So I've been in higher ed for a decade, and then I've also been in business and finance for a little over a decade prior to that. So pretty broad range of experience.
Love it. Well, I want to come back to your experience a little bit in the business world prior to getting into education. And I think it ties in nicely to our conversation today. But when you and I were talking about different ideas to discuss today on the show, one of the common threads was you are passionate about leadership. You know, you care a lot about the role of leadership and the importance it plays on leading an organization. I wanted to start just by asking you why you love the topic of leadership. And then a follow-up to that would be, what do you think the hardest thing about being a leader is?
Yeah, two great questions. I think my passion for leadership comes just from seeing people not be as successful as what I think they could be. I think folks have a lot of talents, but a lot of times people get in their own way. And sometimes they need a coach or someone who can be on the outside looking in and see maybe where they're failing, where they're succeeding, those types of things, and just reassure folks, that they can do this and they can empower themselves and learn and grow. And truthfully, I think anybody can be a leader. I mean, my definition of leadership is really the right person with the right skill set in the right situation at the right time. And so just because we lead organizations doesn't mean people don't have leadership skills. And I just love being able to kind of be that coach and help grow people. I think that's where I get a lot of my self-satisfaction, is when I see people like reach new limits and find that joy in their life from just being able to do something they didn't think they could do. I think one of the toughest things about leadership is the decision-making process. It's not an easy thing to do. And especially as a school leader, when decisions come to us, they're all gray. There's no black and white in this whatsoever. Obviously, we have good teams. And so a lot of these decisions have worked their way up through those teams with no resolution. And so they come to us. And a lot of times our decision making is coming down to playing probabilities. You're really looking at the situation and trying to determine what has the most positive outcome with the highest probability. And you go with that. And sometimes you win, sometimes you don't.
Right. Well, that's a good segue into the rest of the conversation. So we were going to explore this idea of shared language amongst leadership and the importance of developing shared language. And I think that ties back into decision making. Like you were just saying, as a leadership team, you often get brought the biggest and most difficult decisions after they've worked their way through the system, so to speak. Before we get into how to develop shared language amongst a team, I wanted to ask you, in your own journey as a leader, where did you first come across this idea of the importance of developing shared language? Like, what are we even talking about when we say having shared language amongst leaders?
Yeah, a lot of it came from me being in the business world. That's where I was first exposed to it. You've got a lot of different industries. You've got finance, you've got, a lot of different business type industries, sales, and then you have like, heavy machinery, right? Versus like technology and all of these different industries have their own language. It would be hard for me to walk in from a finance industry into a high tech industry and understand even what they're talking about, right? And so that's kind of what got me interested in, well, how do you take all of these different departments, all of these people speaking different languages and put them on the same track so they're going towards the same goal, right? That's where I got into this language thing. I think it's so confusing. I mean, when we think about language, it should really bridge us, right? Language brings us together. And a lot of industries and a lot of organizations, language actually, I think, pulls people apart and just confuses people. And so it was really important for me to understand that, like, if I'm going to lead teams, probably need to bring them together and have somewhat of a shared language.
I think an interesting question, maybe before we get too much into the topic of developing shared language, because you're absolutely right. Getting departments on the same page, having people kind of rowing in the same direction, to use that analogy, is always going to be critical to an organization's success. I guess I'm kind of curious, since you mentioned you first came across this in the business world, and feel free to pull from business examples or school examples. What are the consequences, maybe the negative consequences of not having shared language? What have you observed where this goes wrong before we get into, what it looks like for it to go right?
Yeah, I think a great example is here in our schools. I'll use the example of like our ELD, our English language development programming that we use. When these kids come into our school and they don't speak the language, the common language, which is English, a lot of times they don't feel included, right? And so you're not just fighting the challenge of a language issue, but you're also fighting a cultural issue, an inclusivity issue, and that can lead to a lot of problems. And I think those same things can be said about organizations, right? When someone comes in and doesn't understand the language, are they being included? Does their confidence take a hit? Do they go home and have high levels of stress? I think it's all of those things baked in. Again, language is kind of that base foundation that if we're not all speaking the same language, moving in the same direction, and understanding what we mean when we say certain things, it's going to cause confusion. And that confusion leads to so many other things, and it'll absolutely disrupt any type of organization or movement towards a goal. So the first thing you have to do is get a common language, which sets those expectations. It creates clarity. It puts that foundation in place that everybody can now be empowered and operate moving forward.
How do you think, just from an organizational alignment perspective, it seems like, at face value, this seems like an obvious thing, right? Of course, we all need to be speaking the same language to get on the same page. Why do you think it's not a given? I guess maybe what I'm asking is, why do you think this takes intentionality from the leadership in order for it to be developed versus kind of organically happening?
We have to understand that we all come from such different backgrounds. We all come from such different cultures. So what I made a word to me may be something completely different to somebody else, because we really only know our education, our shared experiences, life experiences, those types of things, right? So when I walk into a room, and keep in mind, based off of my education and my experience, I may be talking about things that mean something completely different to somebody else. And so we can't assume that we know exactly what we're referring to, what our language means. And so, again, I think it's creating that clarity. Again, we come from so many different departments and areas of professionalism that we may be talking a language. Say I'm speaking IT code and my facilities director has no idea what that even means. And if we don't clarify and ask those questions, there's just going to be a barrier there, right? I truly believe language either creates a barrier or it creates a bridge. And it is our job as leaders to get on the same page so that we have more bridges than we have barriers.
Just out of curiosity, in the world of education, like you gave a great example of talking IT code and maybe someone else's just comes from a totally different framework or department, and this can just be anecdotally. Which departments, generally speaking, do you see the biggest cognitive dissonance, if you will, on language? Is it finance and the academics team? Is it facilities and community development? Where do you see this commonly challenging to integrate?
The two areas that I see the biggest disconnect is from the operations side. So you've got everything from transportation talking about how to fix a bus and those types of things, to your facilities department who's fixing roofs and HVAC and all of those types of things, a whole set of language there. And then you've got this academic side, right? And as we know, academics has so many different codes for everything they do, right? Like CLD, culturally and linguistically diverse, right? That's what that means. And so everything on the academic side is an acronym of some sort. And now we're all working in the same organization, but the academic side has no idea what's going on with the business side and the operations side of the house. And the operations side, frankly, has no idea what's going on with the academic side of the house. It's almost like you're running two separate organizations that have to work together.
Okay, so that begs the question, how does a leadership team begin to bridge that gap? Because I think that's a good, you paint the challenge really clearly. And the critical component is that both of those groups, the operations side and the academic side, are working together towards the ultimate outcomes for the students. So let's break down the process a little bit, I guess, and you can speak from your own experiences, but where does developing shared language begin? Like you gave the great example of someone new starts at your organization and all of a sudden it's like a fish out of water. What are they talking about? Why they're using that term for this? So stepping back to where language even begins for an organization, if someone is listening to this and they're a leader and they know this is a challenge, where would you encourage them to begin this process of, hey, we need to develop a shared language amongst our leaders?
Number one, it starts with me as the leader, right? And being very intentional with knowing where I need to take the organization and knowing that common and shared language is a key piece to that. An example I have is, so when I came to the Pinnacle 7 years ago, I was frustrated at the pace of our organization. It was so slow. Decisions couldn't be made. No one wanted to make a decision. We had simple things that needed to happen that had to come to me. I would make a decision that I felt I didn't need to make. This should be made by somebody else. And then for them to move forward with that decision, it just wasn't happening. And so I really had to dig into that. And that was one of my learnings as a leader, was how do you increase organizational pace? What I've learned from that is organizational pace truly stems from trust. So we need to build trust, right? If people don't trust each other, they don't want to make a decision. And so that's why it just became just a lot of barriers to making decisions, and things were so slow. And so I knew I had to build trust. And I knew one of the ways to build trust was to get everybody on the same page and understand each other and build those relationships. And again, that comes from a common language, right? That comes from that shared language and truly understanding people and building those relationships so that when they say something, when they speak, and when they communicate, I understand what they're saying. I'm not making any assumptions. And so it makes both of us look good, right, when we move forward with decisions. So that was a great lesson for me as a leader, is to increase pace. I need to build trust, which is relationships. And so what I started doing is holding meetings with my staff. A lot of it was listening, hearing what language was being used and trying to decipher that myself, and then clarifying when I didn't understand something, because if I didn't understand it, I'm sure somebody else doesn't understand it either. But then also integrating my communication, my language into the team. I think if you let the team try to dictate all of the language, it will be confusing. But I think the leader's goal is to really set the tone for some of that language, use intentional words, and make sure that folks understand what those words mean. And a lot of times it's not even me setting that standard. It's knowing my philosophies, my vision, where I want to go, and then incorporating that vision with that language, and so that they can take ownership of that and kind of move forward and be empowered with that vision on their own.
You brought up a good example of the need to start to bring the team together, and you as the executive leader not being afraid to be like, I don't understand that. Like, pause and explain that for me. I think that's a really good example of breaking down some of the confusion amongst departments. How do you think you have found the ability to evaluate how on the same page your leaders are? I guess like the pace of decision making was probably one that was pretty self-evident to you as you were trying to get things done. But for other leaders who are maybe trying to understand if their teams are speaking the same language, like, do you recommend getting teams together and trying to talk out problems that are unrelated to their departments? Or what are some of the other ways that you feel like a leader can evaluate or get feedback on whether or not there is shared language amongst maybe their other department heads?
Yeah, so I lead a team, an administrative team that has 4 principals, a CHRO, a CFO, and this is what I consider my main leadership team. And This is a team that when I originally started, I had to build a lot of these folks. And it's like, I know the people on this team have the right skill set to be super successful, but they didn't really work well together. There was a lot of infighting. There was a lot of power struggle, power dynamic amongst this team in which they all wanted to lead and no one wanted to follow each other. And a lot of times, if I wasn't in the room in a meeting to referee, the meetings would go sideways, a lot of hurt feelings. And again, that was a situation knowing that, okay, we need to get back to trust in relationships, and we need to do that through some shared language. And so that's where I bring in my philosophies. And again, I always try to use something that's not necessarily just me, but either a book or something in which it's kind of an arm's length. So we're all learning together, but the books or the language within those books and the things we talk about are very intentional in the language we want to use within the organization. And so I'll bring those in. We'll go through those types of tools. We'll talk the language. We'll understand each other. And then I'll use those tools as expectations behind my philosophy so that they understand the why. And then I'll norm those groups as we continue with meetings. A lot of times before a meeting, and it may seem trivial, but I'll go through our norms. I'll make sure we're all on the same page. That way, then when we go into the meeting, we know how to act. We know how to be professional. And then if I see people starting to deviate or get away from that, I will stop the meeting. I will point to the norms and I'll say, we are getting away from this norm here. And this is my expectation. Now let's continue. And again, sometimes I feel like a referee. Sometimes it feels almost childish to a certain extent, but I think we have to do those things so the expectations are clear so that we can start to build as a team on how to treat each other and what my expectations are.
I really like this idea of having established norms and being able to anchor to something that's not a personal opinion, something that we've all agreed to this. And this is the environment of our leadership team. These are the values of our leadership team, and we're going to norm on those and anchor to those. Let's go with a hypothetical here. Let's say a team goes on an offsite. Maybe you have your annual leadership offsite planning. Everyone's fired up. You've reinvigorated your vision and your values. And maybe you've even talked about shared language. These are the 5 things that we're going to anchor to, or here's how we talk about roles and responsibilities, or here's how we talk about being accountable for things. It's easy to come out of those types of gatherings really invigorated and feeling like you're all on the same page. And then you get into real world examples where those things have to play out. Could you maybe share an example or two of maybe a positive example of where shared language helps resolve a challenging circumstance? And then maybe a negative example, or maybe not negative, but maybe a constructive example where you feel like you had to use pre-agreed upon shared language as a learning moment, maybe.
I'll start with the latter. There's certain things on a team, especially when you're trying to build a team, that I think can hinder a team and tear down a team. And on my particular team, I've got some folks who have a real competitive drive. And being competitive is wonderful in certain industries, but being competitive in other industries can be a real challenge. And in education, that's a challenge, especially when I'm trying to align an organization. But then I've got people trying to stand out from other people because they're competitive. That can really tear down alignment, and it can really tear down relationships, especially if you have some competitive people and other people aren't competitive. They're more collaborative, right? I think that's where a negative example of shared language, I think that's where you have to use the language to try to bring people around to, the vision and the goals. But there are times when I have to call people out and say, hey, that seems really competitive. That doesn't seem like it's being collaborative with the team. It doesn't seem like we're aligning. And what I usually see that happens in the long run is that creates silos. That's where you start seeing departments who operate well within each other, but do not operate amongst anyone else. And again, those are the inefficiencies of an organization. And part of our job is to de-silo organizations. And it comes back down to communication and making sure that we're all, again, rowing in, to use your words, rowing in the right direction. We go offsite as a team, and we do visioning sessions and things of that sort. I think the key for me is to continue to remind folks and put these things in front of them, almost like norming them again to that until it becomes ingrained, right? And we know that's going to take time. So again, I have consistent meetings. And a lot of times I use those meetings to norm the group again. If it's a new concept to us, if it's a new direction, we're going to put those norms right in front of us, and we're going to talk through them before we even start that meeting, just to make sure we're moving in the right direction. And another thing I like to do is I like to finish my meetings with the human element, right? Because sometimes we lose sight of those relationships, and the relationships are key to all of this. And so sometimes we need to finish a meeting with talking about gratitude. But many times when we talk about gratitude, it's about our families and the things outside of work that we're grateful for. And very seldom do we ever talk about what we're grateful for within our own organization. So I intentionally bring gratitude towards our organization into those meetings to force people to think about the positive things that are happening and state those. And it seems like then you walk out of that meeting with everybody having tighter relationships, more gratitude towards what we're doing with our vision and mission as an organization. And it sets us on the right path and the right tone to go out and then work with our folks to be able to move them forward.
How have you seen this filter down the organization? Because we've been talking a lot about the leadership team that probably reports directly to you, the department heads, or like you said, your CFO, CHRO, et cetera. How have you seen concepts and values that you and your leadership have normed on? How have you seen those trickle down throughout the rest of the organization? And do you have any recommendations on that process or encouragements that you pass on to your team for ensuring that, the third grade teacher at fill in the blank campus understands that this gratitude, for example, is a core value to the team, just like you as the CEO or your CFO feels and knows that in meetings where that's being normed on?
I always have temperature checks, right? I'm always kind of looking for those certain things to see if things are filtering the way they should be. Again, I think consistency is the key for me. If I'm consistent with my folks, and then sometimes so with my principals, for example, but then I'm also having conversations with the assistant principals just to listen, to hear what they're saying, to see if they're using that common language. And then I'll continue to use that common language with them as well. It's almost like skipping a level sometimes just to make sure that they get a chance to be around me and hear me as well, because then they'll take it down. But I put in little temperature checks, and I'll also put in terminology or certain words that I'm listening for that I know aren't part of the culture. And then I'm listening for those things to see if I'm hearing them on certain levels. So, for example, one of the things that I've built here at the Pinnacles, I have what's called Pinnacle Leadership Academy. And the whole goal of Pinnacle Leadership Academy is to take folks from every department across the school, and I choose 10 every year. And I might have a bus driver, I might have an assistant principal, I might have someone from our janitorial staff. But the goal is to grow these folks. And so my leaders identify who our future leaders are. They encourage them to apply for Pinnacle Leadership Academy. And that application process includes writing a resume, going through an interview process. So if you were to apply for the next job, not only do you have everything ready for it, but you've also gone through HR and you've built that skill set to be able to get that job. But then we sit through sessions, and these sessions are usually once a quarter. One of them might be on charter school operations. The next one might be on the legislative process and policy. And we bring in all of outside speakers, and they get to learn about the bigger picture of a charter school. But even when I'm in those sessions, one of the main points is for me to get to work with who our potential future leaders are. So when they apply for those positions, I can give the thumbs up or thumbs down, whether they're ready or not. But even in those sessions, I'm listening for key terminology. I'm listening to hear, are they talking the same language as their leaders are? And if they are, then I know that communication is really going well within those departments. Then there's other departments where I don't hear those things, and I know communication isn't probably transferring from the top down to the bottom. And so those are areas I make note I need to work with those leaders more.
I want to ask more about the Pinnacle Leadership Academy, but I'm going to come back to that in a second because I'm curious about some of the resources you use there. One other thing I wanted to ask you about was accountability. You mentioned as the CEO, view part of your role as keeping your own team accountable when it comes to shared language, whether that be committing to certain norms or values. But accountability can be really challenging in the education world. And you mentioned you have a business background. And how do I think a lot of times the knock on the private sector or the business world is, oh, it's cutthroat, or it's just all about profitability, or, performance drives everything. And sometimes that can be the reverse in the public sector, where people say, oh, well, you can't hold anyone accountable, or it's all about the mission. And so we don't like to talk about performance or difficult decisions like firing based on performance. How have you found shared language as a leadership team to be beneficial in driving accountability as an organization?
I truly believe that people want to be accountable, but they have to be empowered, right? If you don't empower someone, but you hold them accountable, I think that's where, again, you start building walls versus bridges. So I think you have to do both of those things. And I think the empowerment comes from the shared language. It's that confidence knowing that, okay, I understand where we're headed. I understand the expectations, and I understand what I can and can't do within those parameters. And so then you let someone go. And I think people inherently want accountability. They want to know what the expectations are, and they want to meet goals, right? And so I think we have to be very intentional again with accountability. Again, I think people need it. So for me, what I do is I take some of my practices in the business world and I bring data and dashboards into the school, right? And so when I meet with my admin team on Monday mornings, the first thing we do is we look at dashboards. I want to know what attendance was for the week prior. How many IEPs did we hit that week and how many still are coming due? And I'll change that dashboard as we move forward, as our values or our vision changes. There's certain areas that we need to give more attention to. My dashboard's going to change. And I'll talk with the team prior to, so nothing surprises them. But they love the fact that they know what I'm looking at. As long as I keep that very clear, then you just let them go and they do amazing things, right? But they just need to know, where do I need to go? And you tell them. And I think those dashboards do that. And I think that's also where some of the competition comes in. Competition can have some good aspects to it. And so when you have a dashboard, when you lay out your parameters, then I think people want to meet expectations. And if they're not, then they feel accountable to the team. It's not about being accountable to me, it's to the team. And usually you see those things rectify themselves pretty quickly. I honestly don't believe there should be a difference between the business world and the educational world when it comes to accountability and data and what our expectations are. In fact, we receive taxpayer money to do the work that we do and serve kids. And I think taxpayers should have some comfort knowing we operate on a very high level. We're very efficient with what we do. And in fact, I think some of the practices we have, the business world could use as well.
Love it. Awesome. Well, maybe a final question before we get into some potential recommended resources. If someone was not able to listen to most of this conversation and there was maybe just one takeaway for a fellow leader or one action item for a fellow leader when it comes to crafting shared language amongst a leadership team, what would that be? Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I would, as a leader, ground yourself in your values, right? You have to have your values in place. And I think once you identify what those values are, I think you start to build that language around what those values are. Again, I think this is where your board as a school leader can help you as well, because a lot of times your board has some organizational knowledge, history, and they can tell you what worked, what didn't work. Obviously, they're going to give you some strategic vision as well of where they think you should go. So I like to utilize my board. I like to listen to some of their language as well, and then filter that down, because when you have your middle school principal, for example, presenting at a board meeting and they're using some of the same language as what your board is, boy, it's funny how that board just really comes around and really buys into what you're doing. And so I think that a part of a leader is we have to bridge that as well.
Love it. Awesome. All right. So as we come to a close here, I wanted to ask you about some favorite resources. So you alluded to using potentially books or other resources. I also was curious if the PLA, the Pinnacle Leadership Academy, if you had any developed resources, either that you all have created in-house or that you've found to be particularly helpful externally. Any recommended resources that we can link in the show notes for listeners?
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny, I've been using the same resources now for probably over 20 years. And so anybody who's worked with me over the last 20 years could probably rattle off these resources. They know them. I always fall back, especially in education, on a book called Monday Morning Leadership. You can see this thing is just beat to death.
I love that it's just sitting right there on your desk. You didn't even have to lean over to reach.
Yeah, I always keep it right here, but I have rules that I've written in the back. And my goal is that whenever I finish with a group with this book, they know these rules. I can say, for example, the 50-50 rule. I can say, for example, engaged versus disengaged employee. And we've talked through these things so they specifically understand the definitions and what they mean. And they help them become better leaders and better managers of people. So when I have, say a principal come in and say, Chad, I'm having a problem with this employee and here's what's happening, I can say, oh, engaged, disengaged. Remember what we talked about there? Yes. Where are they? Are they a shining star or are they a falling star, right? And we're talking about, are they in your top 20%, bottom 20%, or are they middle? We can talk about these management philosophies, and it makes us just better as an organization on how we manage people and how we treat people, right? And so even with Pinnacle Leadership Academy, we do a book study and they all have to go through this book because, again, most people don't manage people until you become a leader. And then you have to skin your knees so much. And I'm trying to keep them from skinning their knees and seeing that, hey, there's some rules that you use. And if you just follow these things, you'll be a great manager. And it's not rocket science. It can be a little more black and white. Once a team moves on over that level, so we know how to hire people, we know how to treat people, we know how to manage people, then we move on as a team. It's the 5 languages of appreciation. So it's very similar to the love languages, but it's for the workplace, right?
Nice.
Now it's understanding, how do I build relationships and how am I different than other people? And how do people want to be appreciated? And so that really digs us deeper into who we are as individuals. And that's when we start to take that team and that culture to a new level. But again, these are all organizational language things, right? All we're doing is putting language in place, being very clear about how to understand that, and then learning how to use that within the organization. And then it just brings us closer and closer together.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we'll link to both of those books in the show notes. Chad Miller, thanks so much for being on the show and sharing your leadership insights, and excited for, what others have to learn from this episode. And thanks again for coming on.
Daniel, thanks for having me. And if anybody has any questions, please know I'm always available. You can always reach out, and love the dialogue.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign-up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@byq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.